I live in a small house on the outskirts of town. It's quiet, surrounded by woods. It is ideal for those who like privacy. Until recently, my whole life was calm and measured. But one day, everything changed. One evening, coming home from work, I noticed the door was ajar. I checked the locks and windows. Everything was fine. I thought I had forgotten to lock the door and didn't pay much attention to it. The next day, the same thing happened. I started to worry. I checked the house, but nothing was missing. The strange feeling never left me. A few days later, I noticed footprints on the floor, as if someone had walked around the house in my absence. I checked the house thoroughly, but found nothing suspicious. I decided to install cameras to find out what was going on. A week went by. In the evening, while reviewing the footage, I noticed something strange. A shadow flashed across one of the cameras. My heart beat faster. It was a person. Someone was in my house. I called the police. They came, searched the house, but found nothing. They said it was probably a burglar who wouldn't come back. But a few days later, it happened again. The shadow on the camera appeared again. This time I decided to act on my own. I bought extra locks and installed an alarm system. Now every night before I went to bed, I checked all the locks and cameras. One night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Someone was walking through the house. My heart clenched. I took the flashlight and slowly walked down the hallway. The footsteps subsided. I looked up and saw him, the man in the corner of the room. He stood motionless, looking at me. I turned on the light, but he was gone. It couldn't have been imagination. He was real. In the morning, I called the police again. They searched the house but found no trace of him. They said it could have been one of the local hooligans, but I knew it wasn't. This man was much more dangerous. Another week passed. I tried to ignore the fear, but it took over. One night I heard footsteps again. This time I was ready. Taking my flashlight and phone, I quietly walked to the door. The footsteps were closer. I opened the door and saw him. He was standing there looking right at me. He had a knife in his hands. Without thinking, I rushed into the other room and locked the door. I called the police and waited for them to arrive. The footsteps outside the door fell silent. I heard someone open the window and jump outside. The police arrived a few minutes later, but again found no one. I was offered a temporary relocation until the man was caught, but I couldn't leave my house. I decided to stay and try to deal with it myself. I installed extra cameras and started watching the neighborhood. Now I checked the footage every night and kept an eye on the house. A few days went by. Everything was quiet. I was beginning to think the danger was over. But one evening, on my way home from work, I noticed the door was ajar again. My heart beat faster. I stepped inside and heard a soft sound. Footsteps. He was here again. The noise was coming from the basement. I grabbed my flashlight and, trying not to make any noise, headed down there. As I walked down the stairs, I could feel my heart beating harder and harder. Stopping on the last step, I noticed a faint light. There was someone standing in the corner of the basement. I turned on my flashlight and aimed the beam at the figure. He turned toward me, his face obscured by shadows. A knife gleamed in his hand. I realized there was no time to think. Instantly, I rushed upstairs and locked the door. Running outside, I called the police and hid in my car. A few minutes later, they arrived and started searching the house. I sat in the car and waited for someone to come out with the detainee. But time passed, and the police never found anyone. They said the intruder probably escaped through a basement window. They increased patrols in the neighborhood and advised me to stay with friends or relatives temporarily. I knew it was the right decision, but I didn't want to leave home. An inner fear gripped me, but I decided to stay and fight it. The next day, I installed additional locks and reinforced the alarm system. Now I checked everything several times every night before going to bed. A few days passed in silence, and I began to hope that it was really over. But late one night, I heard footsteps again. This time they were louder and closer. Grabbing my phone and flashlight, I quietly walked to the door. The footsteps came from the living room. Opening the door, I saw a figure moving towards the exit. I turned on the flashlight and shouted, trying to scare him. He froze, then abruptly turned and rushed toward me. In a panic, I ran backward, but he grabbed my arm. A struggle ensued. Striking his hand, he produced a knife, which fell to the floor. I quickly picked it up and pointed it at the intruder. He backed away and I ran outside, still holding the knife in my hand. A few minutes later, the police arrived. I showed them the camera footage and they finally realized that the situation was more serious than it seemed. They began searching the entire neighborhood for the intruder, and they offered me the opportunity to temporarily move to a safe house. I agreed and moved in with a friend of mine for a few weeks. The police continued to investigate, but the intruder was never found. After a few weeks, I returned home, hoping it would be over. Everything was calm at first, but the inner fear wouldn't let go. Every night I was awakened by the slightest noise, checking locks and cameras. A few months passed, and I started to get used to normal life. Late one night, on my way home, I noticed that the lights were on in the house. It was strange, because I always turned off the lights when I left. Cautiously, I stepped inside and heard the familiar sound of footsteps. This time, I was ready. I quickly pulled out my phone and called the police to report what had happened. The police arrived quickly. They inspected the house and found that the intruder had once again snuck into the house through the basement window. But this time, they found footprints and were able to apprehend him. It turned out to be a man suffering from a mental disorder who lived near me. He thought my house belonged to him and tried to go back there. The police took him away, and I felt a huge relief. I now knew that this nightmare was truly over. A few months passed, and I started living a normal life again. But every night, as I checked the locks and cameras, I was reminded of the horror I had experienced. And now I knew I had to be prepared for anything and stay alert. I always considered myself a person living an ordinary, boring life. Work, home, occasional meetings with friends. Everything changed in an instant. Now I live in constant fear. It all started when I noticed that some things in my house started moving. At first it was little things. Keys in a different place. Books arranged differently. I didn't pay attention to it, writing it off to my own forgetfulness. But then I started finding things that clearly didn't belong to me. One evening when I got home from work, the door was ajar. My heart clenched. Stepping inside, I looked around. The house was quiet. Things were in their places, but I felt uneasy. I closed the door, checking all the locks. I had a restless night's sleep. The next day it happened again. The door was ajar again. I decided I had to be more careful. I checked the locks before going out, making sure everything was locked. But it didn't help. When I got home, the door was ajar again. I began to suspect that someone had broken into my house. One evening, deciding to see what was going on, I left the light on and pretended to leave. An hour later, I returned. The door was ajar. There was silence inside the house. My heart was beating so loudly in my chest that I thought I could hear it. Quietly, I crept down the hallway and peeked into the living room. No one was there. He made his way to the kitchen, also empty. Everything was in the bedroom. But when I got to the bathroom, I heard a noise. I froze, listened. Someone was inside. I opened the door. There was no one in the bathroom. I looked around the room and noticed that the window was ajar. A thought flashed through my mind. Someone had entered the house through the window and was hiding in the bathroom. I decided I had to take action. I bought new locks and reinforced the doors. A few days passed. Everything was quiet. But one night, I woke up to a noise. Someone was walking around the house. I got out of bed, grabbed my flashlight, and walked quietly down the hallway. There were no more footsteps. I checked all the rooms. No one. He went back to bed, but he couldn't sleep. The next night, it happened again. I decided to stay awake to catch the intruder. I sat in a chair in the living room and waited. Slowly, the hours dragged by. Suddenly, I heard footsteps. Someone was in the kitchen. I got up and quietly walked to the door. The footsteps got closer and closer. I opened the door, turned on the light. No one was there. I checked all the corners, but found nothing suspicious. A few days went by like that. I hardly slept at all, always waiting for someone to show up. One day, sitting in my chair, I heard footsteps again. This time they were closer. I opened the door and saw a figure in the hallway. My heart froze. The figure stood motionless and then started moving towards me. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy book, and swung. The figure backed away and disappeared into the darkness. The next day, I felt completely shattered. I decided I had to do something about it. I started exploring the house looking for traces. I found an old hatch in the basement. I opened it and found a secret passage leading into the woods. Realized someone had used it to get into the house. Closed the hatch and boarded it up. Hoped it would stop the intruder. A week went by. Nothing happened. I started to calm down. But one night I heard footsteps again. This time they came from the basement. I went downstairs and saw that the boards had been ripped off. The hatch was open. I heard footsteps again, this time behind me. I looked back and saw a figure. It was a man. He was looking at me, a knife in his hands. Before I could react, he lunged at me. We started to fight. I hit him. He let go of the knife. I grabbed him and ran out of the basement, closed the door and locked it. My heart was pounding. I sat on the floor trying to catch my breath. I realized this wasn't going to end until I found a way to get rid of the intruder. I realized I had to act. The next day, I began to think about a plan. If I could trap him, I could keep myself safe. I decided to install hidden cameras throughout the house to watch every corner. A week went by. Everything was quiet. I was beginning to think the intruder wasn't coming back. But one night, while watching the footage, I noticed movement in the basement. My heart started beating faster again. The camera showed a figure climbing through the trapdoor. I realized I had to be at the ready. Taking my knife and flashlight, I went down into the basement, cautiously approached the hatch. This time he didn't see me. I lurked and waited. The figure moved slowly, studying the room. When he got close enough, I turned on my flashlight and shouted to startle him. He froze, then rushed to run for the exit. I was ready for him, blocked the door, leaving him trapped. He started to panic and tear toward the hatch, but I was faster. We began to struggle. The knife in his hands flashed. I barely had time to dodge. I grabbed his arm, knocked the knife away, and he fell to the floor. We were both exhausted. He tried to get up, but I held him in place. Then he looked at me with desperation in his eyes and spoke. He told me that he had lost his house and thought my house was his by right. His story was strange and frightening, but I couldn't take any chances. I knew I had to act quickly. I found some rope and tied him up. He didn't resist. I went upstairs and closed the door. My heart was still pounding. I knew I couldn't keep him here much longer. I decided I had to find a way to keep myself safe forever. The next morning I sold the house and moved to another city. In the new place, I started a new life, leaving all my fears behind. But every night, as I checked the locks and windows, I remembered those scary moments. I knew now that safety was the most important thing. A few months passed, and I began to get used to my new life. There were no more footsteps in the dark, no one following me. But sometimes, waking up in the middle of the night, I felt a slight fear. This experience changed me forever, taught me to be wary and not to trust first impressions. Now I live a quiet life, but I am always aware of what may be lurking in the shadows.